A lonely widow helps a stranger fix his car, never realizing he's her long-lost son. The words echoed in Margaret Wilson's mind as she stood at her kitchen window, watching raindrops trace crooked paths down the glass. How many times had she imagined similar scenarios over the 27 years since her son disappeared? Countless strangers passing through her small town of Millfield, each one scrutinized with desperate hope before the inevitable disappointment set in. The house creaked around her, too large for one person but filled with memories she couldn't bear to leave behind. Outside, autumn leaves swirled across her front yard in the late October wind. Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, feeling the familiar ache in her chest that never truly went away. Another day? She whispered to herself, the ritual greeting to morning that had replaced prayer after hope had grown too painful to maintain. She moved through her morning routine with practiced precision, tea steeped exactly 3 minutes, toast barely browned, the radio tuned to the classical station that filled the silence without demanding attention. The meteorologist predicted rain for the next 3 days. Margaret barely registered this information as she washed her single plate, cup, and knife. The kitchen wall still held the height markers for her son Daniel. The last one, made just weeks before his disappearance, showed he had reached 5 feet 4 inches at 13. Margaret's fingertips brushed against the pencil mark, worn lighter from years of this same touch. "I'm going to be taller than Dad," he had proclaimed that day, standing proudly against the wall while Margaret had marked his height with a pencil held perfectly level. Now, at 62, Margaret's life had contracted to routines and memories. After Richard's death 5 years ago, a heart attack that seemed almost merciful compared to the decades of grief they'd shared, she had withdrawn further from the community. The townsfolk were kind enough, but their pity felt like sandpaper against her raw emotions. The morning mail brought the usual: a utility bill, a catalog she hadn't subscribed to, a flyer for the upcoming Harvest Festival. She set them on the counter without opening any. The clock read 10:30 a.m. Time to open the shop. Margaret's antique store, yesterday's treasures, sat on Millfield's Main Street, a narrow building wedged between the local pharmacy and a coffee shop. The store had been Richard's passion initially, but after Daniel disappeared, it became Margaret's refuge, a place where the past was valued, where broken things were restored and given new purpose. She drove the short distance from her house to the store, wipers sweeping away the persistent drizzle. The gray sky matched her mood as she parked in her usual spot behind the building. The routine never varied. Unlock the back door, turn on the lights, adjust the thermostat, check the register, flip the sign to open. Few customers would come on a day like this. Margaret settled on her stool behind the counter, pulled out her current restoration project, a delicate music box from the 1920s, and lost herself in the intricate mechanics. The bell above the door jangled at 2:17 p.m., startling her from her focused work. A man in his early 40s stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his dark blue jacket onto the welcome mat. Something about his hesitant posture made Margaret's heart flutter unexpectedly. "Sorry to bother you," he said, removing his baseball cap to reveal dark hair peppered with premature gray. "My car broke down about a half-mile up the road. The towing service can't come until tomorrow morning, and the mechanic's already closed. I'm looking for a place to stay tonight, maybe somewhere I could get something to eat?" Margaret noticed his hands, strong but gentle-looking, with a small scar across the right knuckles. Something tugged at her memory, but she pushed the thought away, accustomed to these cruel tricks of hope. "Simmons Inn is just 3 blocks north," she replied, her voice sounding unfamiliar to her own ears. "And Dottie's Diner across the street serves dinner until 8. "Thank you." He smiled and fine lines appeared around his eyes. "I'm Michael, by the way. Michael Lawson, Margaret Wilson." She nodded politely, expecting him to leave now that he had his information. Instead, he lingered, looking around at the antiques with genuine interest. "This is quite a collection. My mother used to love places like this." A shadow crossed his face. "Before she died." The word struck Margaret like a physical blow. She wondered what it would be like to be remembered that way, simply factually dead, rather than suspended in the terrible limbo of the missing. Rain pounded harder against the storefront windows. The man, Michael, looked out at the downpour with dismay. "Looks like I should have brought an umbrella," he said with a small laugh. Before she could analyze her own motives, Margaret heard herself saying, "I could drive you to the inn when I close up. It's only 20 minutes from now." Surprise registered on his face, followed by genuine gratitude. "That's incredibly kind of you. I don't want to impose. It's no trouble. Margaret returned to her music box, her fingers suddenly clumsy with the tiny screwdriver. She felt his presence as he moved quietly around the store, examining items with respectful hands. At 5 o'clock, Margaret locked the register and flipped the sign to closed. Michael helped her turn off the display lights without being asked, as if he sensed the routine. They dashed through the rain to her car, a 10-year-old Buick that Richard had purchased just before his death. Inside, the familiar scent of leather conditioner and the lavender sachet hanging from her rearview mirror enveloped them. Beautiful car, Michael commented, running his hand appreciatively over the dashboard. They don't make them like this anymore. My husband insisted on American-made, Margaret said, starting the engine. He was old-fashioned that way. The wipers beat a hypnotic rhythm as they drove the short distance to Simmons's Inn. Something about Michael's profile in the passenger seat stirred an unsettling familiarity in Margaret. She gripped the steering wheel tighter. "What brings you to Millfield?" she asked, breaking the silence. "We're not exactly on the way to anywhere." Michael's reflection in the passenger window looked pensive. "I'm on a bit of a journey, I guess you could say. Visiting places from my childhood. You've been here before? Maybe. When I was very young." He turned to look at her. "I was adopted when I was 13. My memories before that are complicated." Margaret's heart stuttered. She forced herself to keep her eyes on the road, to keep her voice steady. "Complicated how?" "I was in an accident. Head injury. I lost a lot of memories from before." He said this matter-of-factly, but Margaret heard the undercurrent of loss in his voice. "I've been trying to piece things together. My adoptive parents were wonderful, but they passed away within a year of each other recently. It made me start thinking about where I came from." They arrived at the inn, a Victorian house converted into a charming bed and breakfast. Margaret parked but didn't immediately move to get out of the car. "Have you had any luck?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rain. Michael shook his head. "Not much. I know my birth name was Daniel, but the records are sealed, and the few leads I've found have gone nowhere." Daniel. The name hung in the air between them. "I should get checked in?" he said eventually, reaching for the door handle. "Thank you for the ride, Mrs. Wilson." "It was very kind of you." "Margaret," she corrected automatically, her mind racing. "Call me Margaret." He smiled, and for a moment she saw Richard in the curve of his mouth. Impossible. Her imagination was playing cruel tricks again. "Thank you, Margaret." He hesitated. "Would it be all right if I stopped by your shop again tomorrow? Maybe we could have coffee? I'd like to hear more about the town." "Yes," she said too quickly. "Yes, that would be fine." After Michael disappeared into the inn, Margaret sat in her car for a long time, listening to the rain and trying to calm her racing heart. It couldn't be. She had been down this road of hope too many times. But the name Daniel, the right age, the head injury that could explain why he never came home. "Stop it," she whispered to herself. "Stop it right now." That night, sleep eluded Margaret. She pulled out the box she kept in her bedroom closet, the one with Daniel's things. His baseball mitt, school photos, the model airplane they had built together the summer before he vanished, and the police reports, newspaper clippings, private investigators' notes, the paper trail of a search that had consumed her life for years. Daniel had disappeared walking home from baseball practice. No witnesses, no ransom demand, nothing but his baseball cap found near the creek that ran through town. The case had gone cold despite Richards and her relentless pressure on the police, despite the private investigators they'd hired until the money ran out. Margaret traced her finger over Daniel's last school photo. The same dark hair, the same shaped eyes as the man who called himself Michael. But she'd seen Daniel in countless strangers over the years. The teenage bag boy at the grocery store, the young father at the park, the new history teacher at the high school. Her mind was expert at creating connections that weren't there. Morning came, finding Margaret at her kitchen table with a cold cup of tea and a decision. She would be kind to this stranger, but guard her heart. She had survived this long by learning to live with uncertainty. She couldn't allow herself to hope again. At the shop, Margaret found herself straightening displays, dusting shelves that didn't need dusting, and checking her appearance in the antique mirror by the register. She had put on lipstick for the first time in months. The bell jangled at precisely 10 o'clock. Michael entered, looking refreshed despite the lingering rain. He carried 2 coffee cups from the shop across the street. "I hope you like lattes," he said, setting one on the counter. "The barista said you usually order this." "Thank you." Margaret accepted the cup, touched by the thoughtfulness. "How's your car situation?" "The mechanic thinks it's the alternator." Should be fixed by tomorrow. Michael sipped his coffee. I was wondering if you might know something about this. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and carefully opened it. It was a faded photograph of a house. Margaret's house, from at least 30 years ago, before they had replaced the front porch. Her hand trembled as she set down her coffee. Where did you get this? It was with my adoption papers. No explanation, no address, just this photo. Michael studied her face. You recognize it, don't you? Margaret nodded, unable to speak for a moment. It's my house. But that doesn't necessarily mean… No, it doesn't. Michael agreed gently. But it's a connection I didn't have yesterday. Customers came and went throughout the morning, but Margaret barely noticed them. Michael helped her without being asked, seeming to understand intuitively how the store operated. He had a natural charm that put people at ease, reminding her painfully of Richard. During a quiet moment, Margaret found the courage to ask, This accident you mentioned? When did it happen? Michael leaned against the counter, his face solemn. I was found by a creek about 50 miles from here. No identification, no memory of who I was or how I got there. Severe head trauma. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. And no one came looking for you? Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. They tried to find my family. There were searches, notices in papers, but I didn't know my own name, let alone where I came from. He rubbed the back of his neck, where a thin scar disappeared into his hairline. After a year in foster care, the Lawsons adopted me. They named me Michael. Margaret turned away, ostensibly to rearrange a display of vintage teacups, but really to hide the emotion overwhelming her. The timing, the circumstances, they aligned too perfectly with Daniel's disappearance to be coincidence. Would you like to see my house? She asked suddenly, turning back to him. The one in the photograph. Maybe it would trigger a memory. Hope flickered across Michael's face. I'd like that very much. They closed the shop early, driving through rain that had softened to a gentle mist. The landscape glistened, fall colors intensified by the moisture. Margaret's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Are you all right? Michael asked as they turned onto her street. I lost my son 27 years ago, Margaret said, the words rushing out before she could reconsider. His name was Daniel. He was 13. We never found out what happened to him. Michael's intake of breath was audible. Margaret, I'm not saying you're him, she interrupted quickly. I've made that mistake before, seeing him in strangers. But the coincidences? I have to know. They pulled into her driveway, the house looming before them, a 2-story colonial that Richard had painted blue the summer before Daniel disappeared. It needed painting again now. Margaret hadn't had the heart to change anything after Richard died. Inside, Michael stood in the entryway, turning slowly, his expression concentrated as if listening for echoes from the past. Margaret watched him, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Would you like some tea? She offered, needing a moment to compose herself. Yes, thank you. In the kitchen, Margaret busied herself with the kettle, hyper-aware of Michael examining the room. She saw him notice the height markers on the wall, watched as he approached them slowly. May I? He asked, gesturing to the pencil marks. Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Michael stood against the wall, positioning himself at the highest mark. It hit him at eye level now. He had grown much taller than the 13-year-old boy whose height had been recorded there. Daniel's last measurement, Margaret said softly. 2 weeks before he disappeared. Michael stepped away from the wall, visibly shaken. I have dreams sometimes, he said, his voice strained, about a kitchen like this. A woman at the sink, singing. A man's laugh. The kettle whistled, making them both jump. Margaret poured hot water into the teapot with unsteady hands. Richard, my husband, he had the most wonderful laugh, she said. Daniel used to say it made the whole house shake. They sat at the kitchen table, tea growing cold between them. The conversation moved carefully around the possibility that hung in the air, neither of them quite ready to grasp it directly. I should have photos, Margaret said suddenly, standing. If you wouldn't mind looking? Michael nodded, and she retrieved the family albums from the living room bookshelf. Together they paged through snapshots of a life interrupted, Daniel's birthdays, family vacations, ordinary moments preserved in fading color. He loved baseball, Margaret said, pointing to a photo of Daniel in his Little League uniform. Richard coached his team? I still play sometimes, Michael said quietly. My adoptive father never understood where the talent came from. Neither of them were athletic. They continued through the albums, the similarities mounting, the same cowlick in their hair, the same way of smiling with one side of their mouth lifting higher than the other, the same long fingers that Richard had called piano hands. though neither had played. On the last page of the final album, Margaret had placed the newspaper clipping announcing Daniel's disappearance. The photo showed a smiling boy with a baseball cap, the same cap later found by the creek. Michael stared at it for a long time. "I have nightmares about water," he said finally. "About struggling to breathe, about being carried away. The doctors thought it might be related to how I was found." Margaret's hand shook as she closed the album. "Daniel disappeared near Millfield Creek. They thought he might have fallen in, been swept away." There had been heavy rains that week. The silence between them grew thick with unspoken possibilities. "I have something that might help," Margaret said, standing abruptly. "Wait here." She went to her bedroom and opened her jewelry box, removing a small plastic bag sealed with tape. Inside was a tooth, a baby tooth that had fallen out when Daniel was 8. Margaret had saved it, as mothers do, a small piece of her child to treasure. Returning to the kitchen, she placed the bag on the table between them. "DNA," she said simply. "We could know for certain." Michael stared at the tooth, then at Margaret. "What if I'm not him?" he asked, voicing the fear that had been holding them both back. "What if this is just an extraordinary coincidence? Then I'll have helped a kind stranger." Margaret replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I'll continue as I have been." "And if I am?" His voice caught on the question. "Then a miracle has happened," she whispered, "and we'll figure out the rest together." The next day, they drove to the nearest city with a private DNA testing facility. The process was simple: cheek swabs, forms to fill out, a hefty fee that Margaret insisted on paying. The results would take 3 days. While they waited, Michael stayed at Simmons Inn, but spent his days with Margaret. His car was fixed, but he made no move to leave town. Together, they explored Millfield, Margaret pointing out places from Daniel's childhood, his school, the baseball field, the ice cream shop where they'd celebrated every good report card. On the second day, they visited the creek where Daniel had disappeared. It was peaceful now, water flowing gently between mossy banks, nothing like the raging torrent it became after heavy rains. "I remember fragments sometimes," Michael said as they stood on the small footbridge. "A baseball game. I was angry about something. I decided to take a shortcut home." Margaret held her breath, afraid to interrupt the flow of memory. It started to rain. The path was slippery, his brow furrowed with concentration. "I fell, hit my head on something, then water everywhere, fighting to breathe. Then nothing until waking up in a hospital with strangers telling me I was going to be okay." Margaret's hand found his, squeezing tightly. "The current could have carried you for miles." They searched, but her voice broke. "Not far enough, apparently." That night, Margaret invited Michael to dinner at her house. She cooked Richard's signature pot roast, set the table with the good china they'd only used for special occasions. They ate by candlelight, sharing stories, Margaret filling in the blanks of Daniel's early years, Michael describing his life with the Lawsons, kind people who had given a lost boy a home. "They never tried to replace my birth parents," Michael said. "They always told me that somewhere someone was missing me, that I had been loved before them. We never stopped looking," Margaret said, tears spilling onto her cheeks. Richard died still checking missing persons reports, still following up on every lead, no matter how unlikely. Michael reached across the table, taking her hand. "I wish I could have known him. Again, he would have been so proud of the man you've become," Margaret said. "As I am." On the third day, the testing facility called. The results were ready. They drove in silence to the city, both lost in thoughts of what lay ahead. In the sterile waiting room, Margaret found herself praying for the first time in years, not with words, but with the desperate hope of her heart. The technician called them into a small office, handed them a sealed envelope. "Would you like me to explain the results?" she offered. "No, thank you," Margaret said. "We'll read them ourselves." Back in the car, the envelope sat between them, unopened. Rain began to fall again, pattering against the windshield. "Whatever it says," Michael said finally. "These past few days have meant everything to me." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and unfolded the paper inside. The scientific terminology swam before her eyes, but the conclusion was unmistakable: 99.9% probability of maternity. Michael Lawson was, beyond any reasonable doubt, her son, Daniel Wilson. A sound escaped her, half laugh, half sob. She pressed the paper to her chest, unable to look at Michael, afraid that if she did, the miracle would somehow unravel. Then his arms were around her, his tears mingling with hers as they clung to each other across the center console. No words were needed in that moment of recognition, of homecoming, of wounds finally beginning to heal. Later, they sat on Margaret's front porch swing, watching the rain wash the world clean. The same swing where she had rocked a colicky baby Daniel, where Richard had taught him to tie his shoes, where they had sat as a family on countless summer evenings. "What happens now?" Daniel asked softly. He had decided to embrace his birth name again, though he acknowledged it would take time to feel natural after so many years as Michael. "Now we begin again," Margaret said, her hand finding his. "We have 27 years to catch up on." "I'd like to move back to Millfield," he said. "I'm a carpenter. I could open a shop here. Help you restore some of those antiques." Richard would have loved that. Margaret smiled. "He always said you had a gift for seeing the potential in broken things." They sat in comfortable silence as the rain tapered off. A rainbow appeared, arching over the distant hills, nature's own symbol of promises kept. "Do you know what today is?" Margaret asked suddenly, realization dawning. Daniel shook his head. "It's October 17th, the anniversary of the day you disappeared." She squeezed his hand. "All these years it's been a day of mourning. Now it's a day of finding." As twilight settled over Millfield, lights began to appear in windows throughout the town. In Margaret's house, in Daniel's home, the lights burned brightest of all, pushing back the darkness that had lingered for 27 years. Life would not be simple going forward. There would be adjustments, explanations, paperwork. Daniel would need to reconcile his two identities, to grieve the Lawsons while embracing his birth family. Margaret would need to learn who her son had become, to make space for the man while honoring the memory of the boy. But sitting there on the porch swing, watching nightfall on a day of miracles, one truth shone clearer than all others. Sometimes the longest journeys lead exactly where we're meant to be. Sometimes, against all odds, the lost find their way home. And sometimes, a lonely widow helps a stranger fix his car, never realizing he's her long-lost son, until the moment when both their broken hearts finally begin to heal.